The sun hung low over the quiet military cemetery, its golden light painting long shadows across rows of white marble headstones. The autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and freshly cut grass. There was a stillness in the air, a sacred kind of silence, broken only by the rustle of flags and the distant murmurs of arriving mourners. It was the funeral of a man who had commanded armies, a decorated four-star general who had dedicated his entire life to service, honor, and country. The ceremony was destined to be one of grandeur. High-ranking officials, soldiers in immaculate uniforms, the low thrum of drums, and the solemn presence of honor guards standing at attention, but on the far side of the crowd, away from the polished black cars and official entourages, shuffled an old man. His back was bent, his steps slow and uneven, supported by a wooden cane that had clearly seen better days. His coat was worn thin, frayed at the cuffs, his hat pulled low over his weathered face. He didn't look like much to the world anymore, just another forgotten relic of an older generation. The kind people walked past without a second thought, yet there was a fire in his tired eyes, a deep determination etched in every line of his face. He had come here not out of curiosity, nor to simply pay respects to a man of status, but for something much more personal. His name was Samuel Harlan, an 86-year-old veteran who had served under the very general being laid to rest that day. Every step Samuel took toward the gates of the cemetery seemed heavier than the last, as if his body were protesting what his heart demanded. Memories of a battlefield long ago flickered in his mind: dust, gunfire, men shouting orders over the roar of chaos. And in the midst of it all, the calm, commanding voice of the general who had once saved his life. "Keep your head down, Harlan. You're not dying today." The general had barked in the middle of a hellish firefight. Samuel could still hear those words, echoing in his ears after all these years. They weren't just words. They were a promise. The general had pulled him from the mud, rallied men who had all but given up, and turned despair into survival. Samuel knew that if it weren't for that man, he wouldn't have lived to see his children grow, nor his grandchildren born. That debt, that unpayable bond, was why he was here today. But when Samuel reached the main entrance, he found himself facing two sharply dressed men in suit security, their earpieces glowing under the sun, their posture stiff and unyielding. "Sir, this is a restricted area," one of them said curtly, holding a hand out to stop him. Samuel paused, his grip tightening on his cane. "Restricted?" His voice was gravelly, strained by age but still carrying weight. "I served under General Marcus Caldwell. I was with him in '68. I fought beside his men. I bled for the same flag he bled for. Don't tell me I don't belong here." The younger of the two men exchanged a glance with his partner, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. This section is for dignitaries, family, and invited guests. If you'd like, you can stand near the public viewing area down the road." Samuel's chest tightened. He had imagined standing close to the casket, close enough to whisper a final goodbye. He had rehearsed the words for days, simple words that only meant something to him and the man who once pulled him from death's grip. "Thank you, sir, for everything." But now these strangers in black suits were telling him his presence was not wanted. "I'm not just another onlooker," Samuel said, his voice rising with desperation. "I owe that man my life. I came to salute him one last time." "Sir," the guard repeated, a little firmer now, "I understand, but we can't make exceptions. Please move along." For a moment Samuel stood frozen. The world around him seemed to blur. He could see the flag snapping in the breeze, hear the cadence of boots marching in formation somewhere ahead, and smell the faint gun oil carried on the uniforms of soldiers nearby. But none of it mattered, not when the path to honoring his general was being blocked. He could feel the eyes of strangers on him, some sympathetic, some indifferent, a few even annoyed. To them, he was just an old man making a scene at a solemn event. A younger man in the crowd whispered, "Why don't they just let him through? He's obviously a vet." But another shook his head, muttering, "Rules are rules. Can't just let anybody wander in?" Samuel's hands trembled, not from weakness, but from a mix of anger and sorrow. His voice cracked as he spoke again. Do you have any idea what this man meant? He wasn't just a general to me, he was my brother in arms. He was the reason I'm alive, standing here before you. And you want me to stand behind a rope like I'm some stranger? The guards shifted uncomfortably, but their training held. They didn't budge. Samuel's knees wavered, and for a second he felt like he might collapse right there on the gravel. His cane wobbled, his body weak, but his spirit refused to give in. He straightened as much as he could, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with the effort from the distance. A deep roll of drums echoed as the funeral procession began to move toward the central pavilion. The flag-draped casket, carried by soldiers in pristine dress uniforms, was making its way forward. A sea of decorated officers, political figures, and family members followed, all walking with solemn dignity, and Samuel? He was still standing at the edge of the gate, barred, humiliated. Fighting back tears that burned at the corners of his weary eyes, he whispered to himself, almost too softly to hear, "I promised you I'd be there, sir. I promised." One of the guards sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Sir, I really am sorry. But you'll have to understand, this isn't up to us." Samuel didn't answer. His mind was no longer on the guards. It was with the memory of the general, the sound of his commanding voice, the look in his eyes when he rallied frightened young soldiers in the darkest of hours. Samuel could see it as if it were yesterday, the general's hand grabbing his shoulder, lifting him from the dirt. "You're not dying today, Harlan." The memory cut deeper than any wound he had suffered in combat. And now, the man who saved him was being laid to rest, and Samuel couldn't even step close enough to say goodbye. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as the casket neared. Samuel gripped the bars of the gate with one hand, leaning forward with everything in him, his knuckles white, his voice trembling as he tried one last plea. "Please," he rasped. "Just let me through. Just for a moment." The guards held their ground. And that was the moment, the heartbreaking, soul-crushing moment when the old soldier realized he was being kept from the one final act of gratitude. He had come to give, but what Samuel didn't. No, what nobody standing there knew was that a pair of watchful eyes from within the procession had already noticed him. Eyes that had seen the commotion at the gate, that recognized not just the desperation in the old man's posture, but the unmistakable bearing of someone who had once worn the same uniform. The funeral was about to be stopped in its tracks. The drums slowed their cadence as the casket approached the pavilion. Soldiers moved with mechanical precision, boots striking the earth in perfect unison. The air itself seemed to thicken with reverence, the kind that always hangs heavy over military funerals. And then, in the midst of the ceremony's carefully choreographed order, a subtle disturbance rippled through. A figure in full-dress uniform, with the unmistakable presence of command, paused mid-step. It was General Richard Albright, 4 stars gleaming on his shoulder, his posture proud, his eyes sharp. He had served alongside the man they were burying, had fought in the same wars, carried the same burdens. Today, as the nation bid farewell to one of its greatest warriors, General Albright's duty was to lead the ceremonial procession. But as his gaze swept the crowd, something caught his attention. Near the gate, pressed against the barrier like a man stranded on the wrong side of destiny, stood Samuel Harlan. Albright's stride faltered. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in recognition. He had seen that posture before, not the hunched shoulders of age, but the stiff, unyielding defiance of a soldier who refuses to surrender, even when his body has long since betrayed him. The general slowed, and the others behind him adjusted, unsure of the sudden break in rhythm. A few glanced at one another, confusion flickering in their disciplined eyes. This was a funeral meant to unfold without error, without pause. Yet here was the commanding officer, standing still, his gaze locked on an old man outside the gate. Samuel, head bowed against the rejection he had endured, didn't notice at first. His lips moved silently, forming words only he and the memory of his fallen leader could understand. "Thank you, sir, for saving me." Then, a commanding voice, low, firm, impossible to ignore, cut through the silence. "Wait!" The honor guard froze. The soldiers halted mid-step. Even the crowd seemed to hold its breath. General Albright's word was law, and his single command had stopped an entire funeral procession in its tracks. The guards at the gate stiffened, realizing who had spoken. They turned instinctively, their faces paling as the four-star general strode toward them with deliberate, measured steps. Each click of his polished shoes on the stone path echoed like a drumbeat in the quiet cemetery. Samuel finally looked up. At first, he thought he was imagining it, that his weary mind was conjuring some vision of authority where there was none. But no, the man approaching him, metals glinting in the sunlight, was very real. General Albright's presence was overwhelming, the kind of authority that came not from the stars on his shoulder but from decades of earned respect. His eyes softened as they fell on Samuel. "What's happening here?" Albright asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. One of the guards cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, this man, he isn't on the list. We were instructed to allow only invited guests and dignitaries inside this section." Albright's gaze flicked from the guard to Samuel. He studied the old man for only a heartbeat before speaking again. "Do you know who this is?" The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Albright stepped closer to Samuel, his voice dropping into something far more personal. "Your name?" Samuel swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Harlan, Samuel Harlan. Echo Company, 2nd Battalion. I served under General Caldwell." The words hit Albright like a hammer of recognition. He had read the old rosters, knew the names of men who had stood beside Caldwell in his fiercest battles. And Samuel Harlan. Yes, that name was etched into the history of sacrifice and survival. General Albright straightened, his voice rising so all could hear. "This man is not an intruder. He is one of us. He fought under General Caldwell's command. And if he came here today, it is because his bond to the general was forged in blood and battle. That bond outranks any list." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Soldiers shifted, many of them young, their eyes widening as they realized they were looking at a living piece of history. Samuel's lips trembled. His knees weakened, but not from exhaustion this time. From something far heavier, the weight of being seen, acknowledged after being cast aside. The general extended his hand. "Come with me." For a moment, Samuel didn't move. He looked at the hand offered to him, at the gleaming stars on Albright's shoulder, and felt the clash of two worlds, the forgotten veteran who had been told to step aside, and the commander who was now halting a funeral to lift him back into the fold. With shaking fingers, Samuel placed his hand in Albright's. The general's grip was firm. Steady, strong, the grip of a soldier who knew exactly what this moment meant. Together they stepped past the stunned guards and into the sacred space. As they walked, whispers rose from the crowd. Some dabbed tears from their eyes. Others saluted quietly, honoring not just the man in the casket, but the frail figure now being escorted to his side. The drums resumed, slower now, as if marking the gravity of what had just happened. General Albright did not let go of Samuel's hand until they reached the pavilion, until the old man stood just a few feet from the flag-draped casket. Samuel's eyes welled with tears. His cane clattered softly against the stone as he stood as tall as he could manage, shoulders back, chest lifted. In that instant, he wasn't just an old man anymore. He was once again Private Samuel Harlan, soldier of Echo Company, saluting his general one final time. His hand rose shakily to his forehead, trembling but unwavering in its intent. His salute was not perfect, but it was real, carved from years of service, pain, and loyalty. The silence that followed was profound. Even the birds seemed to still. Every soldier, every officer, every mourner in that place watched as Samuel gave his last salute. And when he finally lowered his hand, a soft murmur swept the crowd, a ripple of emotion that could not be contained. General Albright stood beside him, his own hand raised in salute. Slowly, one by one, the entire formation followed. Dozens, then hundreds of hands rose to foreheads in a wave of honor. The entire funeral, for a moment, belonged to Samuel and the man he had come to say goodbye to. The guards who had blocked him earlier stood frozen, shame written across their faces. But Samuel no longer cared. His heart was pounding, his chest aching, but his soul His soul was lighter than it had been in years. He whispered under his breath, so soft only the wind could hear, "Thank you, sir. I kept my promise." And though the casket remained silent, draped in stars and stripes, Samuel could almost feel the weight of a familiar hand on his shoulder, steadying him one last time. The weight of silence lingered long after Samuel lowered his trembling hand. It was not an ordinary silence, but the kind that sinks into the marrow of everyone present, the silence that comes when hearts understand something words can never capture. The young soldiers in the honor guard stood frozen, their eyes locked on the frail veteran who had just saluted their fallen general. Many of them had trained their whole lives for precision, perfection, and duty, but none of their rehearsals had prepared them for this. For them, the war was textbooks and stories, training exercises, and history lessons. But here, in front of them, stood a living man who had been there, who had carried scars of battles most of them could not imagine. General Albright leaned in close to Samuel, his voice quiet but steady. "You've done him proud today, Harlan. More than any of us." Samuel's lips curved into a weary smile. "I just kept my promise. He saved me once long ago. The least I could do was stand here today." A younger officer nearby, barely in his 20s, broke from protocol and stepped forward hesitantly. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Sir, Mr. Harlan, were you really with General Caldwell? In Vietnam?" Samuel's eyes flicked to the boyish face of the officer. His chest swelled with something that was equal parts pride and sorrow. "Yes," he said simply. "I was there. I was no one important, just another scared kid with a rifle. But the general, he made us believe we weren't alone. He gave us courage when all we wanted was to run. That's the man in that casket? Not just a general, but the kind of leader who makes men live when they think they're going to die?" The young officer swallowed hard, his throat tight. Slowly, he raised his hand in another salute, but this one wasn't for the general in the casket, it was for Samuel. And soon others followed. Young soldiers, officers, even civilians, saluting not just a memory, but the living proof of what that memory had meant. Samuel shook his head, overcome by the gesture. His voice trembled. No, don't salute me. I'm nothing. I was just a boy who got lucky. Caldwell was the reason I walked out alive." General Albright placed a firm hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You're wrong, Harlan. You are something. You are a witness. You carry a piece of him that the rest of us don't. That makes you just as much a part of this legacy as he is." Tears welled in Samuel's eyes. He blinked rapidly, but they came anyway, streaking down his weathered cheeks. His cane wobbled under his grip as the weight of decades of memory pressed down. He remembered the smell of smoke, the heat of explosions, the cries of men calling out for mothers. Brothers, God, he remembered Caldwell, calm amid the storm, steadying frightened soldiers with nothing more than his presence. And now, standing before that casket, it was as though those memories were stitched into the very fabric of the funeral itself. A voice from the crowd spoke up. It was a woman middle-aged, with Caldwell's sharp features in her face. His daughter. She stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. "Mr. Harlan?" she asked softly. Samuel turned, surprised. "Ma'am." "Yes, I'm Emily Caldwell," she said, her voice breaking on her father's name. You fought with him?" Samuel nodded slowly, his throat too tight for words. She stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "I've heard stories of Dad's men all my life, but to see one of you here, to know he meant that much to you, it means more to me than I can say. Thank you for coming. Thank you for remembering him." Samuel's hand shook as he held hers. "He was more than a general to us, ma'am. He was the reason boys like me came home. I never forgot that. Not a single day." Emily's eyes brimmed, and she embraced him. The crowd, once rigid and formal, softened into something deeply human. Uniforms and ranks blurred into the background as people saw not just ceremony, but connection, living proof of sacrifice and loyalty that outlived war. General Albright cleared his throat, his voice strong enough to carry. Ladies and gentlemen, let us remember that funerals are not only about those we lay to rest, but also about those who carry their memory forward. Men like General Caldwell don't just shape history, they shape lives. And today, Samuel Harlan is here as living testimony to that truth. Applause was not customary at military funerals, but it began anyway soft at first, then swelling as more and more hands came together. Not loud, not celebratory, but reverent, respectful. Samuel lowered his head, overcome by the weight of it all. Later, as the casket was lowered into the ground and the rifles fired their three-volley salute, Samuel stood front and center. The sound of the gunfire jolted old memories echoes of jungles and firefights, but he stood firm, his cane planted, his body trembling but unyielding. When the final notes of taps rang out, his tears flowed freely. Afterward, as mourners began to disperse, several young soldiers approached him. Their faces were filled with curiosity, reverence, and something more hope. "Sir," one of them said, "can you tell us what it was like to serve under him?" Samuel smiled faintly, his breath ragged. "It was like, standing in the middle of a storm and knowing the man next to you would never let go of your hand. He wasn't perfect, no man is, but he never abandoned us. And when you're 19, cold, terrified, and sure you'll never see another sunrise, that kind of leadership, it stays with you forever." Another soldier spoke. "Did you ever see him afraid?" Samuel chuckled hoarsely, shaking his head. "Of course he was afraid. We all were. The difference was, he never let it stop him from doing what needed to be done. He carried his fear, and he carried ours too. That's what courage really is, son, not the absence of fear, but carrying it anyway." The young men nodded, their eyes shining. They were learning something no textbook or lecture could teach them. Emily Caldwell rejoined them, her hand resting lightly on Samuel's arm. "Mr. Harlan, would you come with us to the reception? I'd love for my family to meet you. They should know the kind of men Dad inspired." Samuel hesitated, overwhelmed by the invitation. For years he had lived quietly, his service tucked away in the corners of his memory, rarely spoken of, rarely acknowledged. To suddenly be thrust into this moment of honor felt almost unreal. "I'd be honored, ma'am," he said, voice quivering. General Albright leaned in again, his voice firm but kind. "You belong here, Harlan. Don't ever forget that. You are part of this family." Samuel's heart ached with gratitude. He had come expecting to be turned away, to whisper his goodbye through tears at the edge of the crowd. Instead, the world had stopped for him. A four-star general had halted an entire funeral. And now the family of his commander was welcoming him as one of their own as he walked with them, supported gently by Emily on one side and a young soldier on the other. Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt like he was part of the Brotherhood again, not forgotten, not invisible, but remembered. And though his steps were slow, his spirit soared. The reception hall was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that follows a day heavy with grief and memory. Soft light filtered through tall windows, glinting off medals displayed in glass cases along the walls. The air carried the faint aroma of coffee and baked bread, mixed with the scent of polished wood. Groups of mourners gathered in hushed clusters, speaking in reverent tones. Recalling moments of General Caldwell's life, Samuel sat at a corner table, his cane leaning against the chair, a cup of untouched tea before him. He felt strangely out of place, like a ghost among the living. He hadn't attended gatherings like this in years. His world had grown small over time, a modest home, a few neighbors, an occasional visit from his grandchildren. But now, surrounded by uniforms and familiar words, platoon, fire team, deployment, he felt the stirrings of an identity, he thought. He'd left behind. Emily Caldwell approached with her family in tow. Children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, all faces that carried pieces of the man in the casket. They circled around Samuel, curiosity shining in their eyes. "This," Emily said softly, "is Mr. Samuel Harlan. He served with Dad. He's one of the men who knew him not as a general in speeches, but as a leader in battle." Samuel tried to wave off the attention. "Please, I was just a private. Nothing worth remembering." But Emily shook her head. You were worth remembering to my father. That's enough for us." Her youngest son, no older than 12, tugged at Samuel's sleeve. "Mr. Harlan, can you tell us a story about him?" "About my grandpa?" Samuel's throat tightened. For years he had carried the memories like weights, some too heavy to share, others too precious to let slip. He looked into the boy's eager eyes and nodded. "There was a night," Samuel began slowly, his voice gravelly, "when our unit was pinned down in the jungle. We were low on ammo, scared out of our minds. I was certain none of us would see morning. But your grandfather, he crawled through the mud, one man against the dark, and rallied us. He told us we were not dying that night. And somehow, against all odds, we lived. He gave us more than orders, he gave us courage." The boy's eyes widened. Emily covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Around the table, heads bowed in silent reverence, General Albright, who had joined the group quietly, finally spoke. "That was Caldwell's gift. He didn't just command soldiers. He gave men their lives back. And in doing so, he changed the course of history one heartbeat at a time." Samuel nodded, his voice low but steady. "That's why I had to be here today. To let him know I never forgot. To let him know that his sacrifice mattered." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, wrapping itself around every heart in the room. Then Emily placed her hand gently over Samuel's. "You honored him today in a way no ceremony ever could. My father would have been proud to see you here. And so are we." Samuel lowered his head, emotion welling in his chest. He hadn't expected gratitude. He hadn't expected recognition. All he had wanted was to whisper goodbye. But what he received was something far greater belonging. The evening wore on, filled with shared memories and quiet laughter through tears. Young soldiers listened raptly as Samuel described the grit of a battlefield, the weight of brotherhood, the way Caldwell had carried them all on his shoulders. Families embraced him, strangers shook his hand, and everywhere he turned, people treated him not as an outsider, but as a piece of living history. Later, when the crowd began to thin, Samuel stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars stretched endless above him, crisp and clear against the dark sky. He leaned heavily on his cane, his breath fogging in the autumn chill. For a while he just stood there, staring upward. Lost in thought, General Albright joined him quietly, hands clasped behind his back. They stood in silence for a moment before Albright spoke. "You know, Harlan, what you did today, it reminded everyone what this uniform is really about. Not the rank, not the medals. The brotherhood." Samuel smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's easy to forget. The world moves on. Old soldiers fade into the background. But out there today, for a moment I remembered what it felt like to belong." "You do belong," Albright said firmly. "As long as men and women wear this uniform, you belong. Don't ever think otherwise." Samuel swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He whispered, "Thank you." The general placed a hand on his shoulder and gave it a squeeze. Then he stepped back inside, leaving Samuel alone with the stars. For the first time in years, Samuel felt peace. Not because the pain of the past had disappeared, but because he knew it mattered. He knew his service wasn't forgotten. And more importantly, he knew the man who had saved him was honored in the way he deserved. The next morning, newspapers carried the story. General's funeral stopped to honor forgotten soldier. Photos showed General Albright leading Samuel to the casket, the old man saluting with trembling pride. Across the country, veterans read the story and felt a spark in their chests. Families saw the images and remembered that behind every general, every leader, were countless men like Samuel, quiet, invisible, but never unimportant dot in the weeks that followed. Samuel received letters, handwritten notes from strangers, emails from young recruits, phone calls from fellow veterans. Some thanked him. Some shared their own memories. Others simply said, "We saw you. We remember." And Samuel, sitting in his modest home with stacks of letters piled on his kitchen table, smiled more in those weeks than he had in years, because the truth was simple: no soldier, no veteran, should ever feel invisible. The moral of Samuel's story was not just about honoring one man at one funeral. It was about remembering that behind the grandeur of ceremonies and the formality of tradition lies something more: sacred human bonds, forged in blood and sacrifice, that never fade with time. It was about understanding that every veteran carries a story, often silent, often unspoken, but worthy of being heard. And most of all, it was about compassion, about choosing in a world obsessed with protocol and lists to see the humanity in someone who simply wanted to say goodbye. So, if you're watching this now, remember this: honor isn't found in medals or parades. It's found in moments like this, when an old man at the edge of a crowd is brought forward, when his salute is lifted as high as the stars, and when the world pauses long enough to remember him. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see a veteran sitting quietly at a diner, walking slowly with a cane, or saluting a flag on their front porch, you'll remember Samuel Harlan. You'll remember that behind those eyes is a story of sacrifice, of courage, of brotherhood. And you'll remember to stop, to listen, to say, thank you. Because gratitude doesn't need an invitation, because honor should never be reserved for a select few. And because every soldier, no matter how forgotten by time, deserves to be seen. So let this story stay with you. Let it remind you to carry respect, not just in your heart, but in your actions. Share it, speak it, pass it down. Because the legacy of men like General Caldwell and the soldiers who stood beside him lives only as long as we remember. And if this touched you, I invite you to join me in keeping their memory alive. Like this video to show your respect. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your own stories, or simply with the words, "We remember." And don't forget to subscribe, because these stories deserve to be told over and over, until no veteran feels invisible again. For Samuel, for Caldwell, for every soldier who ever gave more than they had to give, lest we forget.